Welcome back to Unsolved Cases by Skoob. I'm your host, Larry Hunter. And today, we're diving into one of America's most chilling and perplexing mysteries. This isn't just a story about poisoned medicine. It's about a nation gripped by fear, a hunt for a faceless killer, and investigations that spiraled into obsession and controversy. This is the 1982 Tylenol murders, a case that changed consumer safety forever and left 7 innocent lives tragically cut short in Chicago. The killer? A ghost in the night, striking without motive, without warning, and vanishing without a trace. For over 40 years, this phantom has evaded justice, leaving behind a tangled web of suspects, false leads, and shattered trust. Today, we'll navigate the maze of suspects, the tangled accusations, and the desperate efforts by law enforcement to crack an unsolvable case. From chilling extortion letters to political intrigue, from high-tech surveillance to DNA dead ends. This is the story of America's most terrifying product tampering case and the fierce battle to uncover the truth. Stay with us, because sometimes the mystery isn't just the crime itself. It's everything that follows in its shadow. When 7 people died from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules, Illinois Governor Jim Thompson had one word for the perpetrator: madman. Health and Human Services Secretary Richard Schweiker echoed this sentiment, calling the poisoner a maniac. These weren't just emotional outbursts. They were calculated attempts to draw the killer into the open. But here's where it gets interesting. As the investigation stalled with no substantial leads, Illinois officials admitted they had deliberately used inflammatory language, hoping to provoke the killer into revealing himself. Think about that strategy for a moment. Calling someone a madman, in hopes they'll be so offended they'll turn themselves in. It's almost laughably naive. Except there was nothing funny about the terror gripping the nation. The FBI brought in John Douglas, the legendary criminal profiler who would later inspire countless TV shows and movies. But here's what most people don't know. Douglas had never worked a product tampering case before. He was flying blind, trying to profile a completely new type of criminal. What Douglas discovered was chilling in its calculated coldness. This wasn't a madman at all. This was something far more terrifying. A methodical predator who didn't target specific individuals or stores. The killer had no clear motive, making this a form of terrorism that instilled widespread fear over the potential contamination of consumer goods. By October 1983, exactly 1 year after the murders, the narrative had completely shifted. Thomas Shump, the idle commander, publicly refuted the madman theory. The killer, he argued, could function normally within society, exhibiting sophistication and planning while maintaining absolute secrecy. Tyrone Fauner, the prosecutor who would become central to this story, described the perpetrator as cold, calculated, and ominously efficient. Dr. Robert Reifman from the Cook County Psychiatric Institute painted an even more disturbing picture: a sadistic yet methodical loner with above-average intelligence. Dr. Daniel Feisel agreed, noting that the logical execution of the crimes suggested the killer was not psychotic at all. Douglas's final profile read like a psychological autopsy of failure incarnate. The killer was likely a man with a history filled with disappointments, someone who craved authority but couldn't maintain employment, someone with psychiatric problems, and periods of depression. Most unnervingly, Douglas predicted the killer would be drawn to discussing the case, seeking validation and attention from anyone willing to listen. Little did Douglas know that within months, someone would emerge who fit this profile perfectly, but not in the way anyone expected. Enter James Lewis, a man whose name would become synonymous with the Tylenol murders for the next 4 decades. But Lewis didn't become a suspect because of sophisticated detective work or breakthrough forensics. He became a suspect because he wrote a letter. In the aftermath of the murders, as the nation remained on edge, Lewis penned an extortion letter to Johnson, and Johnson demanding $1 million. It was this letter, not any connection to the actual murders, that thrust him into the center of America's most notorious unsolved case. On October 21, 1983, Lewis faced trial for attempted extortion in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The 5-day proceedings revealed a prosecution team determined to do more than convict Lewis of extortion. They wanted to paint him as the Tylenol killer himself. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeremy Margolis characterized Lewis as a diabolical conspirator who had turned the world on its ear by exploiting public fear and sorrow. But here's where the prosecution's case becomes questionable. They argued Lewis genuinely believed Johnson & Johnson would wire $1 million to a bank account that had already been closed. The logistics alone made this scenario absurd. U.S. Attorney Dan Webb delivered the final blow, but his closing argument revealed the prosecution's true agenda. Rather than focusing on the extortion charges, Webb attacked Lewis for evading capture. When Mr. Lewis discovered a warrant had been issued for his arrest, what actions did he take? He went into hiding. He changed his name, his job. He did everything to avoid being discovered. But Webb's most damning accusation came next. Is it our fault that he confessed to the murder to exploit a tragedy, causing some to speculate that he might have done it? Think about it. Why would he have acted in the way he did unless he harbored some guilt? Webb concluded by labeling Lewis as a premeditated manipulator of fear, who sought to benefit from a national tragedy. He was malicious. He was cruel, Webb declared, depicting Lewis as someone who used others' suffering for personal gain. The defense, led by Michael Monaco, painted a completely different picture. Lewis, according to Monaco, never intended to collect the money. His real goal was to embarrass his wife's former employer for failing to meet payroll obligations. Since the account was closed and inaccessible to Lewis, the idea that he seriously expected payment was ridiculous. In a moment of startling candor, Monaco told the jury, "You may convict him of being stupid and foolish and reckless, but you cannot convict him of this crime." He argued that while Lewis's action might constitute a crime, it wasn't the specific crime he was charged with. Most dramatically, Monaco confronted Lewis directly in court, exclaiming, "You wrote a letter, and because of it, you were hunted like a dog." This trial established a pattern that would define the Tylenol case for decades: the transformation of circumstantial evidence and questionable behavior into criminal conspiracy theories. If the Lewis case showed how desperation could drive prosecution, the Kevin Masterson affair revealed how politics could corrupt an investigation entirely. Masterson's brief stint as a suspect reads like a masterclass in election year manipulation and media trial by fire. Picture this timeline. It's November 1st, 1982, just one day before Illinois elections for Attorney General and Governor. Suddenly, Kevin Masterson's name appears on Tyrone Fauner's suspect list. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated. Masterson became a suspect based on statements he allegedly made months earlier about wanting to retaliate against two stores, Jewel Food and Frank's Finer Foods. Here's the problem. Frank's Finer Foods never actually had any poison Tylenol at their locations. The manager at Frank's expressed complete confusion over any alleged vendetta. The supposed grudge against Jewel Foods had slightly more substance. According to an Illinois State Police affidavit, Masterson's resentment stemmed from an incident involving his former wife, Joanne, who felt mistreated by Jewel's security officers over shoplifting suspicions. This led to a civil lawsuit that ended with Joanne receiving $8,000. But connecting this personal grievance to mass murder required an enormous leap of logic. By December 1982, with suspicions officially lifted, Masterson's parents spoke out about the devastating impact of media attention on their family. John Masterson, Kevin's father, lamented how his son had been used by the media, contrasting promises of a fair trial with the reality of trial by television. But here's the most revealing detail. federal authorities never labeled Kevin Masterson as a true suspect. A law enforcement source in Washington told the Chicago Tribune there was no concrete evidence tying Masterson to the crimes. He was merely someone with loose talk, but not a viable suspect. The timing of the November 1st news story suggested it could boost Foner's re-election campaign and Governor Thompson's chances. However, on Election Day, Foner ultimately lost his re-election bid, while Thompson narrowly defeated Adlai Stevenson. Masterson, who was residing in California during this media circus, eventually surrendered himself, only to be immediately ruled out as a suspect. His brief involvement was nothing more than political theater in the broader machinations surrounding the Tylenol investigation. This episode established a troubling precedent: the willingness to sacrifice individual lives and reputations for political gain and investigative momentum. Of all the suspects in the Tylenol case, Roger Arnold presented the most compelling circumstantial evidence and the most tragic outcome. Arnold's story reveals how a series of coincidences can transform an innocent man into a prime suspect, and how the weight of suspicion can destroy a life. Arnold was detained without the possibility of bond as city detectives probed deeper into what Lieutenant Locallo called a series of coincidences that emerged during Arnold's questioning. These coincidences formed a perfect storm of suspicion. First, Arnold admitted to police that he had possessed cyanide until August 1982, just months before the murders. He had allegedly threatened to use cyanide capsules to harm his estranged wife. Arnold worked at a warehouse that officials considered a distribution center for some of the adulterated Tylenol. Most unnervingly, he was acquainted with the father of one of the Tylenol victims. When police searched Arnold's home, they discovered items that deepened suspicions: reading materials about poisons, a recent cyanide order, and 2 one-way tickets to Thailand, purchased in late September for departure on October 15th. Arnold claimed this was his customary annual trip, but his attorney, Thomas Royce, contradicted this, stating that despite being characterized as a soldier of fortune type, Arnold had never actually visited Thailand. Arnold was eventually released on October 13th after posting $6,000 bail, but his freedom came with a price: continuous police surveillance. Royce described the monitoring as so extensive that he and Arnold resorted to meeting in McKinley Park to converse without being overheard. Even then, detectives would approach and demand identification. Despite the circumstantial evidence, Detective Marty Ryan acknowledged a crucial fact: it doesn't appear the man Arnold is linked with the Tylenol poisonings. No cyanide was found in Arnold's residence during the search. Upon release, Arnold proclaimed his innocence emphatically. "They can say what they want. I am not a suspect. I had nothing to do with this Tylenol thing at all. This is more circumstance than anything." Regarding the cyanide, Arnold offered a cryptic explanation: "It just happens that they blew it out of proportion. I'm not saying what the chemicals were used for, but it was nothing illegal." Perhaps most intriguingly, Arnold made a puzzling statement that would prove prophetic: "I knew the family, unfortunately, but not the suspect." This comment would gain significance 12 days later, though its meaning remained unclear. Arnold's case demonstrates how the accumulation of circumstantial evidence can create an illusion of guilt, even when no direct connection exists. His life was forever altered by coincidences and timing, creating a template for how the Tylenol investigation would continue to destroy lives in its wake. Roger Arnold died on June 16, 2008, at age 74. His death marked more than the end of a life. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter in the Tylenol investigation. For investigators who had spent decades chasing shadows, Arnold's death removed a significant obstacle to renewed public scrutiny. In 2008, a clandestine Tylenol task force was quietly established in Illinois, comprising investigators from the FBI, Chicago and suburban police, and the Illinois State Police. Grand juries in Cook and DuPage counties were assembled to examine evidence related to the 1982 murders. The timing wasn't coincidental. With Arnold gone, there was no longer any fear of him being questioned by journalists about matters officials preferred to keep hidden. His death made it easier for authorities to move their investigation from the shadows into the public spotlight. The revival strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Refocus attention on James Lewis. In 2009, the FBI and Illinois State Police agents searched the Lewis apartment and collected DNA samples. The media ate it up. Headlines proclaimed that the Tylenol case was active again, that authorities were closing in on the killer. But here's the problem. There was no new evidence. The revived investigation served as what investigators call useful distraction. It kept the public focused on Lewis while deflecting attention from the investigation's fundamental failures and the possibility that the real killer had never even been identified. The FBI's sudden renewed interest raises disturbing questions. In 1999, when Wally Kowalski of Pennsylvania State University requested Tylenol murder documentation under the Freedom of Information Act, FBI section, Chief John M. Kelso, Jr., responded that there were no records indicating the 1982 Tylenol murders were subject to an FBI investigation. Think about that. In 1999, the FBI claimed they had no records of investigating the case, but by 2009, they were suddenly leading a major task force. What changed? The most logical explanation is that Arnold's death provided an opportunity to rewrite the narrative without fear of contradiction from a key figure who knew the truth. When the case was revived, the original legal professionals re-emerged, like actors returning to a stage. Tyrone Fauner told NBC News Chicago that Lewis was the prime suspect, but they lacked proof to convict him. Yet Fauner has never provided any evidence linking Lewis to the actual tampering. This revival strategy accomplished multiple goals. It gave the appearance of active investigation, it satisfied public demands for justice, and it protected the reputations of officials who had spent decades pursuing the wrong suspects. By 2010, even the Lewis narrative was wearing thin. The FBI had collected DNA samples from both James and Leanne Lewis, but James couldn't be blamed for the 1986 Tylenol murder because he was in prison at that time. This logistical impossibility forced investigators to get creative, leading to one of the most bizarre chapters in the Tylenol saga. Enter Ted Kaczynski, the UNABOMBER. In a move that can only be described as investigative desperation, authorities began floating Kaczynski as a potential suspect in both the 1982 and 1986 Tylenol cases. The theory was seductive in its simplicity. If you can't solve a terrorism case, blame it on a known terrorist. The shift became public in May 2011 when journalist Michael Sneed of the Chicago Sun-Times spoke with Tyrone Fauner about the FBI's interest in Kaczynski. Fauner, who had spent decades pointing fingers at Lewis, suddenly seemed to have barely any memory of his former prime suspect. After almost 30 years of considering Lewis the main culprit, Fauner was ready to pass the baton to the UNABOMBER. Even Kaczynski's former attorney, Robert Blazier, suggested him as a potential suspect, adding credibility to the theory. Irv Miller, a legal analyst for CBS News, who had been an assistant state's attorney during the original 1982 murders, viewed the collection of Kaczynski's DNA as a valuable law enforcement tool to eliminate suspects from the case. But here's where the theory falls apart under scrutiny. The FBI already possessed Kaczynski's DNA from his previous prosecution. Their request for a better quality sample suggests they weren't trying to eliminate him as a suspect. They were trying to find a way to implicate him. The Kaczynski theory follows a disturbing pattern in federal investigations. Blame unsolved cases on dead or imprisoned suspects who can't defend themselves. This strategy mirrors how authorities blamed the 2001 anthrax attacks on Bruce Ivins after his death in 2008, despite significant holes in that case as well. The appeal of the Kaczynski theory is obvious. He's a known terrorist with a history of using mail to deliver deadly devices. He's already in prison for life, so there's no risk of wrongful conviction consequences. Most importantly, he fits the public's image of what a mass killer should look like: a disturbed loner with clear antisocial tendencies. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. The Tylenol killer displayed characteristics that don't align with Kaczynski's known methods. The UNABOMBER was precise, methodical, and chose specific targets for ideological reasons. The Tylenol killer was indiscriminate, creating random terror without apparent motive. If the FBI manages to posthumously frame Kaczynski or another convenient scapegoat for the Tylenol murders, it would represent a victory for federal officials, the state of Illinois, and Johnson & Johnson. They would finally have their madman for both the 1982 and 1986 cases, allowing everyone to close the books on America's most notorious unsolved terrorism case. As we reach the end of our journey through the labyrinth of suspects and theories, one thing becomes crystal clear: the hunt for the Tylenol killer has become as destructive as the original crime itself. Over 4 decades, this investigation has destroyed reputations, ruined lives, and turned the pursuit of justice into a series of desperate gambits and political calculations. Roger Arnold's life was consumed by surveillance and suspicion based on coincidences. Kevin Masterson became a political pawn in an election-year publicity stunt. James Lewis was transformed from an extortionist into a murder suspect without any evidence connecting him to the actual killings. And now, Ted Kaczynski, already serving life in prison, may become the final scapegoat in a case that has consumed everyone it touches. What we've learned is that sometimes the investigation becomes more dangerous than the crime. The need to solve the unsolvable, to satisfy public demands for justice, and to protect institutional reputations can drive even well-intentioned people to compromise their principles and destroy innocent lives. The real Tylenol killer, if still alive, has watched this spectacle unfold from the shadows. They've seen lives destroyed, careers ended, and families torn apart, all in pursuit of a ghost. Perhaps that was part of the plan all along. Perhaps the ongoing chaos and misdirection is exactly what they hope to achieve. John Douglas's original profile suggested the killer would be drawn to discussing the case, seeking validation and attention. But what if the killer's greatest satisfaction comes not from talking about the crimes, but from watching others be blamed for them? What if the real terror isn't just the initial poisonings, but the decades of investigative carnage that followed? The Tylenol murders changed America forever. They altered how we package products, how we investigate terrorism, and how we think about random violence. But perhaps their most lasting impact is what they revealed about our justice system's capacity for self-destruction when faced with the unthinkable. As we continue to live in an age of terrorism and random violence, the Tylenol case serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the unknown killer lurking in the shadows. It's our own desperate need to find someone, anyone, to blame for the unexplainable. The hunt continues, but after 4 decades of false leads and ruined lives, we must ask ourselves, at what point does the pursuit of justice become injustice itself? And, in our determination to catch a killer, how many innocent people are we willing to destroy along the way? The Tylenol murders remain unsolved, but they've solved something else. They've shown us exactly how far we're willing to go when fear drives our search for answers. And that revelation might be more terrifying than any poison lurking on a pharmacy shelf. That's our descent into the twisted legacy of the Tylenol murders. An act of terror that was supposed to lead to answers, but instead left behind decades of confusion, paranoia, and silence. But this isn't just a story about poisoned pills, tamper-proof seals, or public warnings. It's about how fear can outpace reason, and how a nation's need for justice can sometimes cloud the search for truth. Yes, Investigators chased hundreds of leads. Yes, suspects were named, interrogated, and in some cases, publicly ruined. But what about the suspect files that went cold? The theories that were dismissed too quickly? The political pressure that shaped the narrative long before the facts were even fully known? And maybe the bigger question is this: what happens when justice becomes more about closure than truth? Because when public safety is weaponized, suspicion becomes policy. When fear overrides process, anyone can become a suspect. And when the system fails to find answers, what fills the void is uncertainty. The Tylenol case is real. Its impact? Massive. Its culprit? Still unknown. And its legacy? Still casting a shadow over every seal we break and every pill we swallow. To explore more suspects, FBI files, unearthed evidence, and alternate theories we couldn't cover in today's episode, head over to the Skoob app for the extended case archive. Whether you think it was a random madman or a carefully covered-up act of domestic sabotage, one thing is certain: the Tylenol murders remain one of the darkest, most unnerving puzzles in American criminal history. Download Skoob now on the App Store or Play Store. I'm your host, Larry Hunter. Thanks for joining me on this journey through fear, doubt, and the endless search for answers. And remember, the most dangerous mysteries are the ones we convince ourselves are already solved. Stay cautious, stay questioning, and stay tuned.